I'm happy to welcome here on the panel, Middle East at the Crossroads, Mr. Dlawer al-Aldein. He's the founding president of the Middle East Research Institute, former Minister of Higher Education and Scientific Research in Kurdistan Regional Government and Professor of Medicine at Nottingham University, UK. Very warm welcome, sir. Here on the other side, Wolfgang Pusztai, Chairman of the Advisory Board, National Council on US-Libya Relations and Senior Advisor of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. And later on the internet will join us Mary Fitzgerald, non-resident scholar of the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. The line is not ready yet. Sir, Professor, after 1 year now of the terrible war in Gaza, one year after the Hamas onslaught on Israel, from your point of view, where are we now? How do you see the current situation in the Middle East, and how did we get there?
Thank you so much. How did we get here, and where are we going from here?
Not here, there.
Yeah. First of all, I thank you, the organizers, AIES, and everyone else, to be here with you, such a fine group of people. It's a privilege. I will talk about the big picture in the Middle East. I know there are some very good experts here, but not everybody is deeply familiar with the dynamics in the Middle East. But at the end, I'm going to focus on two issues. One is the word deterrence. The other one is the word leadership. It is a game of deterrence, and I'll explain how. This year, it's the 45th birthday of Iranian regime. The Iranian regime was only a year old when Iraq attacked it, supported by the United States, the West, and many Arab countries in the region. 8 years later, both countries went bankrupt, but Iran survived it. This war shaped Iran's strategies up until now. It's security focused. It needed to make sure this will never happen again to it, coupled with its own ambition of spreading or advancing its empire building or exporting the revolution. It meant that they start with Iraq and the rest to make sure that every country that poses a threat is not in a position of posing a threat. And that includes Israel and the United States. So Iran survived that war and then took every opportunity that came to the Middle East to advance its strategies and achieve that. So regime change in Iraq, 2003, was one of those. The United States became a belligerent occupier of Iraq, but very quickly disengaged, especially from Obama days. Iran managed to overwhelm Iraq's decision-making process, undermine it, and then weaken the state. It then took the Arab Spring as an opportunity to do exactly the same to both Syria and Yemen. Again, undermined it. These countries were already fragile, moving into greater fragility, almost to the brink of failure, or failed. The same happened in Lebanon. So if you look at the picture, you may find a lot of state, non-state actors mixed up together. The Middle East fragmented, divided along sectarian, religious, and ethnic lines, and everybody's militarized, polarized. Then we have another complexity added on to the local dynamics, and that's regional rivalry, as well as global rivalry. But from the day that the United States refused to lead and disengaged, it created a new situation, a new environment for regional powers to take matters into their own hands, none of whom are actually interested in democracy, stability, good governance, or any of those values. So they took matters into their own hands. Iran emerged strong. Turkey, Israel, and finally some of the Arab countries got their act together. They all are now taking the lead while Europe is suffering from the consequences of those instabilities because they are not in a position to lead so that they can deal with the instability that ultimately gives them refugees, terrorism, and loss of trade. Relying on the United States to provide that leadership, and the United States refuses to do so at times. It does it when it suits its strategy, and it can change not every 4 years, but could change every 4 weeks. So here is the game of deterrence. Iran has considered the United States and Israel, as well as Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf, as the strategic threats, the countries that need to be deterred. In the absence of a nuclear bomb, there is a threat of making one. That's one deterrence. And then building missiles, drones, and anything else that you can throw at Israel or the Arabs. Not airplanes, because the airplanes are old now, 45 years old, lack spare parts. And then they have proxies, as well as vassal states-like situations. So those proxies everywhere have become more capable, better trained, and prepared to fight for Iran. And that's what happened in Lebanon. Hezbollah became a state within state. Hezbollah's arsenal of missiles and capacity to threaten Israel used to be one of the deterrents. We have Yemen, we have Syria that became completely integrated into Iran's overall security structure. And then Hamas, even though they are not Shias, they became part of that resistance front, as well as Iraq. So for a long time, the United States and Israel thought it's becoming increasingly difficult to face Iran in the face of all this buildup that is a threat, and Iran genuinely thought or gave the impression that Hezbollah alone in Lebanon is enough to make Israel think twice. No matter how much arsenal they built, Iron Dome, you name it, but Hezbollah is super capable. Israel also gave the impression that they are not only able themselves to defend themselves within a huge range of aerial mileage, and they've been using that, but also they were the only side that had the full backing of a superpower and engaged the regional Arabs, regional countries, to be cooperating with them, as you saw during the Iranian strikes, that they were helping with downing missiles and drones. So Israel had their engagement, and more importantly, with the United States pulling out, more or less, not pulling out, but called disengaging, Israel convinced the Arabs, as well as many regional countries, that there should be a new structure, a new alignment that can actually ultimately oppose Iran. So they were in the middle of making that. That's what the Abraham Accord was all about. That's what the world was going towards until 7th of October last year. On 7th October 23, Iran was convinced that they undermined and completely burst the myth of Israeli deterrence. They thought that they not only surprised Israel, but they could have overwhelmed its internal resistance by having even more Hamas guys going into Israel. Israel could not afford that. He needed to regain that deterrence. So they went full speed, all its weight, into destroying Hamas. And they have, a year later, managed to reduce Hamas to what ISIS used to be, i.e. a movement, groups, and partisan kind of resistance, but losing what was the caliphate for ISIS. They have lost Gaza as a governing system. The next layer is Hezbollah. Israel managed to isolate Hamas without anybody able to go for their help until they destroyed it a year later. Not only that, they even chased their leaders inside Tehran. So they regained that deterrence. And Iran was the one vulnerable. So Iran needed to keep its street credit and demonstrate its power to threaten by sending some missiles, and Israel wanting to retaliate symbolically, but they both show that they can threaten each other. It's up to us to decide who did better, who did more, whatever. But then Hezbollah was strategically the biggest threat for Israel, and for Iran, Hezbollah was the most strategic ally they had in the region, not only to threaten Israel, but also to keep Syrian regime in. That's Hezbollah doing it. And in the absence of Qasem Soleimani, who was killed by the Americans, Hezbollah leader became the spiritual as well as security leader, even for Iraqis to an extent. Yemenis respected him a lot. Israel had to start that because Hezbollah was attacking Israel as well. But for Israel, it was important to isolate Hezbollah in the way they isolated Hamas. They made sure of that via America. They were left alone. They did exactly that. They started plowing through Hezbollah. Hezbollah is far more structured, far more established, institutionalized than Hamas. It's not easy, but nonetheless, left alone, Israel can do it in the fullness of time. It's a war of attrition. But they started eliminating their leaders, destroying their military infrastructure, destroying houses, pushing the population into displacement. Iran can't afford just to watch that. They wanted to move, but then they realized the United States is there, threatening, saying we will come in. What is next? This deterrence is now lost to Iran. Israel has now regained that. 7th of October is forgotten. Then people think this is an opportunity for Israel to go for the big shot. They call it the head of the snake. That Israel cannot do alone. In fact, cannot do it full stop. It needs America. The United States has to think hard what to do. Israel can deal with Hamas, with Hezbollah, but not further. And Iraq is another. We have powerful non-state actors who are more powerful than the state. Their loyalty is to Iran. Israel cannot deal with that alone, needs America.
May I ask you a question on that? Obviously, the relations between Netanyahu and President Biden were very bad. I've just read the book War by Bob Woodward. Obviously, the two didn't get along at all with each other. And now Donald Trump is re-elected. He's best buddy with Bibi. Already Security Minister Ben-Gvir is saying now we are going for Iran and now we're going for the big shot. Do you think the new president will change the situation?
Well, people, when read rhetoric, they think that Trump means more war, means all-out escalation against Iran. But that's actually not the feeling you get in Washington. If anything, Trump would like this matter to be done with during the transition between the election and the inauguration in January.
Next month.
This 2-3 months are critical. If Israel was protected and left to plow through Hezbollah, they can actually bring Hezbollah to its knees and then left with Iran what to do. Preferably, if they needed to attack Iran, Trump can always say, you do the bigger part militarily, then I will come and face a weakened Iran and impose conditions, and they will be well advised to listen. And then there will be peace on my terms without war. But if that didn't work, then there has to be a combined military and non-military solution. So the Netanyahu-Trump combination may not necessarily mean all-out war, but it will mean another level of escalation. Now, this is where the deterrence issue is now. We're in the middle of it. Iran is worried about the next step because for Iran, there is an onion. The outer layer was Hamas. You can say Houthis. Then underneath those was Hezbollah, very important. But then you can get rid of Hezbollah, but there is Iraqi backyard. And you can get rid of that. Then there is the state of Iran. You can get rid of that, but it's the regime that needs to survive. And the next escalation would be a threat to the regime. And that's where they fear American-Israeli combination with the Arabs. That's where Iran needs Russia and China. But let me go back to the first one I started. I said I'll end with not just deterrence, but leadership too. I come back to something I alluded to. United States, the way it dealt with the Middle East, there's no coherent, persistent, clear strategy that you can plan on that basis. Not like China, not like many others plan the next couple of decades. We have to be careful. Even the people who are allies to the United States, they do not feel secure enough to build on American promise. So their disengagement is at will, including in Syria, for example, their presence, in Iraq, it could be, anywhere. This means that Europe has to live with the sources of instability that keeps giving you refugees, that keeps giving you terrorism, that keeps you losing this neighborhood that is immediate neighbor, whereas for America, it doesn't matter that much. But Europe has not been in a position to provide any leadership. EU is not designed to be acting as a state or has been an assertive foreign policy, but member states are not talking to each other enough. They are not doing things together enough. So the vacuum of leadership that we have at the global and regional level stays, and Europe has not filled it. We do not expect Europe to fill the vacuum by military presence or putting money into it. It's a political issue. It's a leadership that can actually bring some sense to this region. But no, we are left to this, and the best thing the European member states do when you talk to them, they say, yes, here's what the Americans should do. That's as far as they go. This is where what is coming, the near future, is still in the hand of people who are not as interested in Europe in stabilizing, in common sense, and in actually stabilizing Middle East so that Europe could be stable. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Wolfgang Pusztai. You have prepared something for us, the war in Palestine, its implications for the rest of the world.
So the question is, why did it happen? There were a couple of Israeli mistakes before the war that have sent the wrong signal. I would like to mention first that the Israelis did everything to free soldiers that ended up in the hands of Hamas or Hezbollah. I would say the peak of this kind of policy was the Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange deal, when one Israeli soldier was exchanged against 1,027. And one of these 1,027 was the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. And he got the message, if we take Israeli hostages, we are able to free our Palestinians from the Israeli jails. The next one was that since after the Lebanon war in 1982, the Israeli Defense Forces were always very careful to accept own casualties. This sent the wrong message. When they were fighting against Lebanon, against Hamas in Gaza in 2014 and against Hezbollah in 2006 in Lebanon, they avoided close encounters in built-up areas wherever possible. So the consequence for Hamas was, we are taking the prisoners, we are withdrawing into the cities of the Gaza Strip, and the Israelis will not follow us. The next one was that the Israelis had a clear picture of what was going on in the Gaza Strip, but they draw the wrong conclusions. And maybe even the most important was that Israel did not win any war decisively against its Arab opponents since 1982. As you've said already, they have lost the respect of their enemies. If we talk about the withdrawal from Lebanon and Gaza, the Israelis said it made politically sense. We have won there, we can withdraw. If you talk about the wars in 2006 and 2014, the Israelis said we have won in Lebanon and in Gaza. The Arabs see it in a different way. So this led to the war objectives of Hamas and the axis of resistance. This was about the liberation of Palestinian prisoners by taking Israelis prisoners and exchange them at a very favorable rate. By gaining global support for its case. Yes, thousands of Palestinians were killed in the Gaza Strip. But of course, Hamas is also provoking these casualties in order to influence the international opinion. And finally, the aim was to achieve a humiliation of Israel, to show again they don't deserve the respect of our fighters, in order to shape the preconditions for its destructions. The Israeli war objectives are consequently against dealing with these objectives of the axis of resistance. First and foremost, as you have already said, they want to regain the respect of their opponents. In Gaza, you know it, they want to eliminate Hamas, and some people doubt it, to free also their hostages. In Lebanon, they want to establish their security zone up to the Litani River. At the West Bank, they want to eliminate as much terrorists as possible. With regard to Iran, the question is it just about deterrence right now, or is it about eliminating the nuclear threat? And yes, several Israeli hardliners have also another objective. They want to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible from the West Bank and from the Gaza Strip. But this will be never ever accepted by their neighbors Jordan and by Egypt. A brief look at the region, as you have explained this already before. The region must be seen also through the conflict between the Sunni and the Shia, which dates back more than 14 centuries. It must be seen through the eyes of the Arab-Persian rivalry. At the last time, the Gulf War, which ended in, if I remember correctly, in 1989. So Iran seeks nuclear weapons to be able to achieve deterrence against its opponents, and also in order to be able to threaten its opponents. To threaten its opponents, to pressure its opponents like Israel right now. Does it work? Good question. I would say the axis of resistance has already used up almost everything they have on hands. Yes, they have more of the same, especially with regard to Hezbollah and probably also the Houthis and also Iran. But if they use their latent power, their missiles, if they fire them and they don't achieve any significant damage in Israel, this latent power was mobilized without achieving any kind of damage, of objective. So I think they will think twice, or I hope they will think twice, before another attack. The Abraham Accords were, as you've said before, also to achieve a common front line against Iran. But they were also an attempt to break Israel's isolation. And if one knows that the air defense of the United Arab Emirates is using right now Israeli Barak 8 air defense missiles, I would say it worked. Hamas has realized that the Abraham Accords might work, and the Iranians have realized it. Therefore, one of the reasons for triggering the terrorist attack in October last year. Please be aware, we are talking here at two layers. We are talking about the national interests of these moderate Arab governments in Egypt and in Jordan who have peace treaties, and among the countries who have signed the Abraham Accords, and the layer of the population on the streets. This means not necessarily what you see on the streets of Cairo is what the policy of the government is. You need to look behind. At times, and I would like to emphasize only at times, this is also triggered by some Islamist groups, including by the political Islamists of the Muslim Brotherhood. At times. Nevertheless, if you discuss with the average Arab, he will give you his point about Israel very clearly. So, I've mentioned the Iranian missile arsenal. A key question for Israel is, how vulnerable is the state of Israel? And this brings me to ballistic missile defense. There was a lot of reporting about ballistic missile defense in the media. There was a lot of reporting and mentioning about the Sky Shield initiative. It's not that easy. It's not that easy. At first, you can see number one, when a ballistic missile is launched, it is usually detected by the American Cyber's space-based infrared system, which gives an alert and detects what's going on, into which direction the missile or the missiles are heading. They are providing the information within seconds to the Cheyenne Mountains in the western United States. Deep in the mountains, you have probably seen it times in the movies or in some of the movies. At the Cheyenne Mountains, they are deciding, the computer system is deciding into which direction is this missile heading. Who needs to track the missile to find out what is the target? And then this station in the Cheyenne Mountains, the ballistic missile warning system of the United States, alerts a ballistic missile early warning system. You cannot compare these ballistic missile early warning radar systems with something like the Austrian or the German air surveillance system. A typical air surveillance radar sees only up to about 25-30 kilometers. We are talking about here missiles approaching from the space. This means you need a specific radar to detect this. And as soon as the radar has detected these missiles and has identified the path and the probable target area, it transfers the information to the ballistic missile defense stations. You can see here a green pine Israeli radar system, and then it's about to fight it. And the decision to do a mid-course intercept is usually done within 30 seconds after the launch is detected. After 30 seconds, the arrow-free missiles is heading out, heading over to Iran, and as we've seen last time, destroying a couple of missiles already over Iranian space. The problem is that this arrow-free missile system, a battery, can only deal with about 14 intercepts at the same time, simultaneously. The Israelis have about 3 batteries of arrow-free, about 4 batteries of arrow-2, which is about to intercept the incoming missiles in the upper layer, which means the missile is arriving through the space and comes down. And above 120 kilometers, this is for arrow-2, the next layer, and below it's David Sling. And by the way, the Patriots are playing no role in this. The Patriots are playing no role in this. And another one, because this is sometimes mentioned in the media, the Americans should not deliver this kind of missiles to the Israelis. Not a big issue. The Americans are producing some components in order to have a technology transfer from Israel to the United States. But the missiles are produced in Israel. Those missiles are produced in Israel. A certain problem are so-called hypersonic maneuvering missiles, which come in with hypersonic velocity, and at the final stage of their before impacting, they are maneuvering. This is what the Israelis had needed to realize at the Nevatim Air Force Base, where the F-35 were based. But the disadvantage of these hypersonic maneuvering missiles is that they are losing their precision, as we've also seen at Nevatim. Let me be clear, it is not, regarding Europe, it is not realistic in the foreseeable future that a middle-sized country like Germany, or even the whole European Union, establishes its own ballistic missile defense system. Neither Germany nor the European Union as a whole is able in the foreseeable future to establish such a system without having significant support from the Americans, especially with regard to the space-based components. You have already covered most of the external and global players, so I just would like to mention that you are aware of this. The credibility of the United Nations is also in the Middle East very low. The Israelis simply don't trust them. The UN resolution from the year 2006, which was about the withdrawal from Hezbollah from southern Lebanon, was never ever implemented. The European Union, yes, I agree with you, but the key question is, which tools do the Europeans have at hand? I would say that's diplomacy and diplomacy. The European Union has no means to pressure or to push or to have specific incentives, neither for the Israelis nor for the Arabs. We need to realize this, and Europe needs to work on building up these tools. So it's not about exaggerating the situation of the Americans or whatever. It's about realizing where we are. And it is necessary to build up our toolbox. And this is not only about the military. Turkey is a good example for how to build up its toolbox. Turkey has security interests with regard to the Kurds, and they are doing this. They have built up their military, their drones, their fighter jets, and so on to deal with this. Erdogan is considering the political Islam as one of the mainstays of his presidency in Turkey. And consequently, he is also cooperating with political Islam, with the Muslim Brotherhood, with Hamas and others throughout the Middle East. Russia considers Iran as an important partner, as we've heard before. It does everything to undermine the Western influence in the region. China is still a rising star. And what is I would say, a quite interesting development over the last month is that Egypt is about to replace part of its F-16, American F-16 fleet, with Chinese J-10C fighter jets. And by the way, the Chinese J-10C fighter jets are based on the Israeli Lavi fighter. The Lavi fighter, which was never ever produced in the 90s, and the technology, let's say, allegedly ended up in China. I did not mention the United States yet. What can be expected from President Trump? from my point of view, he will pursue the national American interest. And he has clearly outlined in the National Security Strategy in 2017 what are his objectives. What are his objectives? And this is exactly where he will start when he takes over on January 20. And yes, if there is a possibility to let the dirty work to be done before, he will accept it. I'm not fully agreeing with you with regard to the Israeli capabilities about striking the nuclear arsenal of Iran. The backbone of the strikes are the so-called hypersonic missiles launched from fighter jets. There is one nation, no, there are two nations who have this kind of weapons. Those are the Russians with their Kinjal missiles, which have a lack of precision and a lack of range, and this is the Israelis. The Israelis did the strikes at the most important high-value targets with these hypersonic missiles from fighter jets. The Americans don't even have this kind of weapons. But you're right, with regard to intelligence, with regard to providing combat search and rescue in the case a plane is downed over Iran, they need the United States, no doubt about this. So, Trump is here to protect vital American interests, also in the Middle East. His credo is preserve peace through strength. This means provide and guarantee security of Israel. And this means, next point, deny the Iranian regime all paths to a nuclear weapon. Remember what he said a couple of weeks before. If he would advise the Israelis, he would say, hit the nuclear first and worry about the rest later. And he means this for serious. Having a look on the Israeli position, would the Israelis sleep better if Iran has nuclear weapons? Or would they sleep better if they hit Iran, push back the Iranian nuclear program for a couple of years, and then have a negotiated agreement with Iran about supporting the economy and so on, through also with the help of Europe, to prevent Iran from gaining again close to a nuclear weapon? That's a good question. And you remember what I've said with regard to Israeli objectives with regard to Iran. So at the very end, what way out? Will we see a regional war? I think rather no. It's not in the Iranian interest. It's all about interests. And the Iranians will certainly use this threat as a weapon in the current conflict. But Iran seeks to build a common front among the Muslims against Israel. It does not seek to unite the Muslims against Iran. And if they would strike the oil fields or whatsoever, this would unite the Arabs against Iran. They have nothing to win in a war with the rest of the world around Iran. And this is against their economic interests. They would harm their very fragile own economy, and they would also annoy their important partner, China. China has absolutely no interest in such a conflict. Please don't forget, China is getting about 48% of its crude oil from the Middle East.
Thank you very much. I hope
Yes, hello and good afternoon
Good
from
afternoon.
Brussels.
Mary Fitzgerald is a writer, researcher, and consultant specializing in the Mediterranean region with a focus on Libya, where she spent some time during the Arab Spring. Mrs. Fitzgerald, obviously Israel is doing militarily well, but rather not politically. Many think Israel has lost its proportionality. The anger about Israel's proceeding in Gaza is rising all over the world. Yesterday, Israeli football fans were chased in the streets of Amsterdam. How do you see it from Brussels?
Well, again, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to take part in today's discussion. I would like to focus initially just on some of the macro dynamics in the Middle East and North Africa region we've seen over the last 10 years or so, and what that may be pointing towards in the future. And I would start by noting that the grievances related to governance, economics, and poor prospects for the region's massive youth bulge, its worth remembering here that majority of populations across the Middle East and North Africa have a huge youth cohort. Basically, in some countries, 2/3 of the population remain under the age of 30, 35. So a massive youth bulge that was very key to driving the series of uprisings and revolutions that were collectively described by some in 2011 as the Arab Spring. And the grievances, as I mentioned, relating to governance, relating to the economic situation, and generally poor prospects for that youth bulge, they were really key to those developments in 2011. Worth noting again that if you are a young person in the region, not only are you facing high unemployment, poor economic prospects, but then this in turn affects how the rest of your life unfolds, because it causes a delay in marriage. It causes a delay in terms of having a family, because people cannot afford a home to live in, etc. So all the usual markers of adulthood in these societies are delayed. And this has caused enormous frustration and driven the sense of grievance. So none of those grievances really that drove the events of 2011 have been addressed since. What we've seen happen, particularly over the last 10 years, is we've seen very much some people in the region describe it as a counter-revolution against that kind of rise of protest and anger and frustration in 2011. But basically, we've seen a snuffing out of dissent, a snuffing out of protest. We've seen a return to authoritarianism in Egypt since 2013, but also strikingly in Tunisia, which was held up as, you know, that kind of flickering flame of the hope that 2011 represented. However, in the last couple of years, we've seen Tunisia again slide back into authoritarianism. So the outlook right now in the region for those in the region who basically demanded in 2011 a more dignified life. You know, it was very striking as somebody who was on the ground in 2011 that, you know, many of the chants and slogans referred to dignity, a more dignified life. Now, that, of course, could be interpreted in different ways. There were slogans calling for democracy, but a dignified life was key to these demands that drove the protests in 2011. And what we've seen is a return of repressive regimes and governments across the region using all kinds of new tools, particularly technological tools to survey, to monitor, and to essentially control their populations and prevent another outbreak of protest as we saw in 2011. But essentially what we're seeing is a kind of a pressure cooker effect, because the grievances have not been addressed. Instead, we're seeing a new layer of repression. Some would argue much more repressive than existed pre-2011. And all of these ingredients combining together in a way that some economists I've discussed this with in the region, they predict that what the region could be facing in the future is the Arabs, as one economist put it to me, the Arab Spring 2.0. And this particular economist predicted that if this happens, it's likely to be far bloodier and far more anarchic than what we saw in 2011. So I think that that's, you know, a kind of a sobering kind of overview of some of the macro dynamics we're seeing in the region, that because there are so many fires, if you like, breaking out in certain parts of the region, the Gaza war, the war in Lebanon now, you know, tensions remaining in Syria, in Iraq, and in Libya, that some of these kind of macro trends tend to be overlooked. So I think it's important to note. I would also mention that you know, Europe's approach to its southern neighborhood, the southern Mediterranean neighborhood. When I talk to individuals, particularly those who are involved in what has now become a very narrow and restricted civil society space in countries across the region, they are quite critical of Europe's approach to the region. After kind of a period in the years following 2011, more kind of openness, engagement, there is a sense, there is a perception that Europe's approach to the region has again been reduced to a narrow lens, primarily a securitized lens, certainly a migration-focused lens, which these civil society figures would argue does not augur well for the future based on past experience. They also argue that the return of embracing by the Europeans of the strongman paradigm in the region, they would argue that this is short-sighted. And again, goes back to my point earlier in terms of the grievances that drove 2011 not being addressed, however, with this new layer of repression on top and the kind of pressure cooker effect that is risks creating. So my interlocutors, again, within that kind of civil society sphere, including people who engaged a lot with European organizations, with European officials, they would argue that a more holistic approach to the region is needed. The approach right now is very reductive, it's very one-dimensional, and it's ultimately short-sighted in terms of, in the long term, they would argue, creating more problems than it actually will end up resolving. The other point I would like to make is, again, related to the potential fallout from the interconnected wars in Gaza and Lebanon. This is a conversation across the region. What is the fallout? What will be the impact in the various countries of the region? The wave of protests we saw late last year when Israel's offensive on Gaza began in response to the October 7th attack. Those protests have largely died out across the region, but the public anger and resentment and frustration over the conduct of the war in Gaza remains very, very live. And there are all kinds of conversations happening across the region in terms of the potential fallout from that. We have seen media coverage recently suggesting that, for example, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is very concerned about managing public sentiment in Saudi Arabia because of this anger, because of this frustration, because of this rage over what's happening in Gaza. There is a suggestion there that Saudi Arabia could be facing protests or also a radicalization. Saudi Arabia has grappled, of course, with domestic extremism, domestic terrorism in past decades. So I think, again, this shows the concern that we see as part of the fallout from the wars in Gaza and Lebanon, a wider kind of anger, frustration, possibly tipping into a new wave of radicalization across the region amongst the younger generation, a new wave of radicalization that could manifest itself in several different ways, including armed extremism. So I think that these are some of the conversations that are happening in capitals across the region, how to manage that fallout. If the war in Gaza in particular continues in its current form, day by day, publics across the region are watching the footage coming from Gaza. It's now been over a year of this, and the impact of that cannot be understated. So what I would end with is just a reminder to keep in mind everybody's focused, of course, on the war in Gaza, on the war in Lebanon, but keep in mind those macro dynamics I mentioned earlier, because I think in analyzing those macro trends and dynamics, we get a sense of where the region might be in 5 to 10 years' time. And many, as I mentioned, including economists from the region, would argue that some of the signs we're seeing as a result of those macro trends are quite worrying indeed.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, you have now the opportunity to ask questions to the two gentlemen here on the podium or to Mrs. Fitzgerald in Brussels. There are two people with microphones, please, who would like to ask the first question.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for your talk. I think we all took a lot from it, and it was very informative. My question would be to either of you, whoever is more happy to answer it. What is Saudi Arabia's role in, especially the new government of Donald Trump maybe coming back with an additional Abraham Accord for them, and looking to tip the power balance in the region, maybe more towards an Israeli favor? And if there was ever going to be an armed conflict between Israel and Iran, which you briefly discussed, what would the role of Saudi Arabia be? Thanks very much.
Would you like to?
Well, I'd be happy to comment, but we both can. The leadership of the Saudi Arabia has had very clear policies or strategy, or at least outlook towards the United States. The experience with the Biden administration was not brilliant. It had lots of ups and downs. At times, they wouldn't even answer their phone call, the president's phone call. They clearly are seen to be more in line with the new administration, but that doesn't mean it will all go their way. What is key to remember is that this war and all these big shakeups did not affect the Israeli-Saudi outlook, the Abraham Accord, the relationship, and deep inside the move towards normalization, including United Emirates, has been ongoing without slowing down. And who was the mastermind behind this was Trump's previous administration, and there are clear indications that they will go back to it straight away. The Saudis are very worried about Iran provoking them or including them in any future tit-for-tat or attacks. They are vulnerable. They cannot rely on either their own capacity or the United States, so they emphasize that they would remain neutral, but they are not neutral. And the Iranians always consider Saudi as one of the major strategic enemies, or foes rather than enemies. And they always express their lack of trust in the Saudi policies that sides, at least sentimentally or otherwise, towards the Israeli agenda. So can Saudi keep itself or protect that image and then keep itself out of any future conflict? It's difficult to predict, but the Iranians are engaging the Saudis directly. They've engaged them via China. They at least would like to neutralize them and make them at least not side with all their capacity and airspace, not to be at the service of Israelis. So it will not be a black and white, all out, either with me or against me or enemy or friend. It will simply be protecting their current state of lack of engagement, lack of animosity, even if there is a war. The Saudis, as well as the Jordanians and others, did take part in downing a lot of the missiles that came from Iran. And the Israelis have not yet declared exactly where their fighter jets were flying from or into. So that means it's difficult to predict, but everybody wants to protect the Gulf, who are very vulnerable to any future conflict.
I think 2 sentences for Mr. Pusztai.
Yep. Donald Trump has a very good relationship to the leaders in Saudi Arabia, personal relationship to the leaders in Saudi Arabia and in the United Arab Emirates. With regard to the stance of the King of Saudi Arabia, one must not forget he is the guardian of the 2 holy cities. And the guardian of the 2 holy cities cannot speak out in favor of Israel. There is no doubt about this. On the other side, the Saudis remember very well the attack by the Houthis and by the Iranians on the refinery, the largest refinery in the country, I think it was in 2018, when all the American technology was not able to help them out. Now they hope there is someone else to help them. Israeli technology.
Mrs. Fitzgerald, would you like to comment on that as well?
Yes, I would, and you know, it is indeed the case that none of those countries that signed up to the Abraham Accords have in any way suggested that they may distance themselves. But I do think when it comes to Saudi Arabia, you know, it's interesting. Bob Woodward's recent book War, which you know recalls and documents some of the conversations, you know, after October 7th last year in terms of Anthony Blinken's conversations with his interlocutors in the region. And it was very interesting because, at least in the account that Woodward has relayed in that book, Mohammed bin Salman is concerned about how public sentiment is going in Saudi Arabia. And I think it is worth recalling that when those countries were signing the Abraham Accords during the Trump presidency, public opinion polling in those countries showed that actually, while governments were signing the accords, public sentiment was not on board. And indeed, there was a lot of criticism or opposition, of course, that could not be manifested in different ways because of the nature of these societies. But, the public were not on board. So I think now the concern for some of these governments is that basically, they're not going to distance themselves from the accords, but on top of what their publics have seen over the last year in terms of the conduct of the war in Gaza and how that has roiled public sentiment, very real concerns there in terms of how they're going to kind of reconcile public sentiment towards this along with the realities of the accords continuing.
I think the next question is back there, and then you, first the gentleman behind you, and then you.
Thanks a lot. What do you think about the bigger role of Europe taking
And the lady in the front.
responsibility in the Middle East?
Sorry?
About Europe taking a bigger role and responsibilities, especially in the Israel-Palestine question. We have these mechanisms. In the Balkans, for example, we have imposed a NATO mission on Kosovo after the war. We have also liberated Kosovo. So the situation would be translated. The Balkan role model to the Middle East, which I want to remember, is always a part of the former Ottoman Empire, so it's not out of the area, actually. So the question would be, logically, if you apply that model, that we stabilized Gaza by making a NATO mission there and not having Israeli destroying Gaza completely, and also the question of the post-Gaza settlement now, post-war settlement for Gaza is also a very important one, because there's a big fight in the Israeli government at the moment what should be done after winning the war, or winning, whatever it means, destroying Gaza. But the question would be, can NATO take a big role? And if the Europeans want a two-state settlement, is it not the only logical way to have NATO membership for Israel and also for Palestine later, in order to have a long-term stable peace settlement for the region?
Maybe we collect a few questions. Please. Would you like to answer that one, the first one?
Well, I have a question actually to Mr. Ala Al-Din, as you are from Erbil, not that far away from the Turkish as well as Iranian border. I just wonder, how do you see the role of Turkey? Because on the one side, it's against Israel, but on the other side, we have a rivalry actually for a long time between Turkey and Iran. So about the influence in the region. Thank you.
And maybe now the lady in the first row.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the three very, very interesting presentations. My name is Matoya Wolf. I'm the chargé d'affaires of the Spanish embassy here. I would have a question more for Mary Fitzgerald, but also the two other speakers could also respond, maybe. It's about some efforts by the European Union and some member states, and in particular Spain, but also others, around the Union for the Mediterranean. So how do you see the role of this kind of bi-regional organization in the present in general? It is the only organization that reunites Palestine and Israel. Unfortunately, at the last conference, at the last meeting last month in Barcelona, Israel was not present, but it has been present in previous meetings. So let's have your view on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Fitzgerald, could you please start with that question?
Sure. I think the Union for the Mediterranean, as the only intergovernmental body that brings together the countries that lie around the Mediterranean, has enormous potential and has since it was established. But I think that, one of the challenges it faces is that, and speaking today from Brussels, those of us who work in the region have seen how the region, whether we talk about the southern Mediterranean or the eastern Mediterranean, it has really fallen off the priority list here in Brussels. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it has fallen even further down the priority list. So we see, an EU institutions that are far more focused on what's happening to Europe's east than they are on the southern neighborhood. And no one I talk to in Brussels expects that that's going to change anytime soon. That's a reality that we have to live with. I would also note that Kaja Kallas, the former Estonian Prime Minister, is soon to replace Josep Borrell as the EU High Representative. And this is expected in Brussels and elsewhere to kind of further deepen, if you like, this kind of tilt towards Europe's east and move away from a focus on its southern neighborhood. Borrell, of course, a Spaniard who was engaged very much in Mediterranean conversations. We've seen his engagement when it comes to the Gaza war issue, but all the indications show that under Kaja Kallas, because she's Estonian, because of her focus on the war in Ukraine, etc., that we will see that continuing trend of a move away from attention on the southern neighborhood. And I think to finish, I think that's going to be very challenging for the Union for the Mediterranean and that kind of wider conversation about Euro-Mediterranean relations, because simply it's not a priority now as much as it was, say, in the years that immediately followed 2011.
Mr. Al-Aldin, Turkey and the region.
Right. Turkey is not anti-Israeli, so full stop. Turkey is upset that Israel defeated Hamas. Turkey is upset that they can't do much to help Palestine and Palestinians, so they keep the populistic rhetoric on and they keep playing with those words. But in reality, trade between Israel and Turkey, many people believe, have increased since the war. Their military drills together are still ongoing. Their relationship has not really in any way suffered in any meaningful way. But sentimentally, of course, in Turkey, people are expressing concerns and they are pro-Palestinian cause and so on. So Turkey has done nothing to upset Israel, and they will do nothing to upset Iran either in terms of this getting involved in this direct conflict. So Turkey and Iran are rivals in the region, but they have not had wars or direct confrontation between each other for the last 550 years. But they are fighting at every corner, and there's blood everywhere. And this is how it stays. This game is done like that. So Turkey will not allow Israeli jets to fly over it. Well, they will not allow the reverse of that. But nonetheless, Turkey is protecting its resources to see Iran weakened, because they are suffering from Iranian hegemony in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. They are losing out in this, and they are being more directly interventionists across their border. They securitize their borders because of these weak states. So Turkey would like to see a weakened Iran. They would like to see a lesser rivalry between them and to gain more in the Middle East by weakening Iran, but they will never go into direct confrontation. If anything, interdependence between Turkey and Iran has been increasing. Money, as well as all sorts of other trade, have been increasing with Iran. So let's not think in black and white thinking that Turkey sees itself vulnerable or sees this conflict completely against its overall security or national security interests. They try to avoid. They try not to be party to it. They are not happy about many things happening, but nonetheless, they are not interfering to protect either Iran or Israel. So that's really Turkey. In terms of Europe, the question that was asked, European involvement in the Middle East and NATO role compared to Balkan. I might leave a bulk of that question to Wolfgang, but let me just say this. First of all, there is no such thing as Europe. We do not see that. We see France, we see Britain, we see, well, not Britain anyway. We see Germany, we see a lot of these presence, but we don't see a cohesive European thinking strategy. And NATO is divided. The thing in the Balkan, the interventions of the past interventions in the Balkans worked only when the United States came united with Europe and together did things. And they led the way at the end. At the moment, United States is fully behind Israel, keeping Europe out of the loop. You can see that President Macron was so upset that at the back garden, which is Lebanon, traditionally is where France should be most active, they could not do anything. They were not even consulted. So DC, Washington DC and Israel did things much to the distaste of a lot of Europeans. And the Europeans are also very divided, including NATO, when it comes to who should do what in terms of engaging Syria, for example, in terms of Lebanon, in terms of policy towards Israel, and whether to help with weapons, with movements, whatever. So unless the United States and Europe agree on something, and that is within NATO, there will be no cohesive or coherent European approach to the Middle East, or Europe try to do something in the Middle East that looks like leadership. That's where I stop.
I don't see a particular European role in the wars in Gaza and in Lebanon. Nothing like this before there is a stable ceasefire. Thereafter, Europe would certainly not only have a role with regard to reconstruction, but also with regard to civil society building and building of administrations. There are lots of skills in Europe how to help to build civil societies and administrations. But please be aware, we should not use our standards with regard to the quality of these civil societies and with regard to the quality of these administrations. I don't see any UN peacekeeping troops in Gaza. The Israelis would be certainly against this because they don't want to have any Austrians or Indian soldiers as human shields in the hands of Hamas. I don't see any role of NATO in the Gaza Strip for the same reason. I don't see, although it might maybe work, a role for NATO in southern Lebanon. UN has no credibility whatsoever with regard to Lebanon. NATO maybe has, but who is NATO? Are we talking about Americans? You remember the Beirut barracks bombing and other incidents. I'm not sure that the NATO states are ready and willing to accept the risk of a NATO peace support operation in Lebanon. What might be a way out for the Gaza Strip? I've indicated this on my last slide with Yasser Arafat, Beirut, 1982. I've explained this recently in an interview to Al Jazeera. A way out might be to have a deal similar to Beirut 1982, to allow the remaining Hamas fighters, yes, who are the remaining Hamas fighters, and their families to leave the Gaza Strip in exchange for all the remaining living hostages. This would still leave us with the question what to do thereafter. But this might be an opportunity to end the war in Gaza, at least for the time being. I don't see a NATO membership, neither for Israel nor for the Palestinian territories, because NATO certainly doesn't want to be dragged into a war in the Middle East. Actually, I don't see any lasting solution for the crisis in the Middle East, not in the lifespan of the children right now born in Israel or in the Palestinian territories. I don't see a realistic, and you will probably agree with me, maybe we are even talking about the grandchildren, probably. I don't see the two-state solution for two reasons. One is, you know, from the river to the sea and so on, this is a non-acceptable solution for the Palestinians. By the way, you know, there are many people, I would like to use the example from Poland, who needed to leave from eastern Poland and moved over to western Poland at the end of the Second World War. Imagine that they would have settled on the eastern border of Poland and wait to return to their hometowns in what is now another country. Yes, I know that's not that easy. And the last point is, from the shores of Tel Aviv to the West Bank, we are talking about 14 kilometers, 1-4. The Hamas intrusion into Israel was 20 kilometers. It is simply not possible for the Israeli military to prevent a renewed terrorist attack of the scale of what we've seen last year if there is a two-state solution.
Mrs. Fitzgerald, you quoted the book of Bob Woodward. I've read it as well. He describes the role of Anthony Blinken, the foreign secretary, trying for a year now relentlessly to avoid a spreading of the conflict. Obviously, he was told by some Arab leaders the Israelis should deal with the Hamas as they like to, but take care of the civil population and look for a political solution. Obviously, the Israelis didn't do that. What is your perspective?
Well, again, I think, it's one thing in terms of what different Arab leaders said in terms of, it's very difficult to find Arab leaders who are particular fans of Hamas, particularly Arab leaders who have themselves been opposed to Islamist movements within their own territory. So no love lost there between many Arab leaders and Hamas. But again, the point you make, I think it's the conduct of the war since last October, the horror of which is being played out every day, all day, every day on Arab TV channels and Arab social media. And this then, again, accentuates the fears, the concerns I mentioned earlier in different Arab capitals in terms of how to manage the anger and the frustration of their own populations. And definitely, and as I mentioned in Woodward's book, we hear that directly through the account of Mohammed bin Salman's discussions with Anthony Blinken. So I think that's a real concern. Some may argue that, the war has lasted as long as it has. It's been conducted in a particular way that, the level of anger and resentment and frustration is kind of fever pitch. Can it get even worse? Some would argue possibly not. But I think the ramifications of that, whether in Arab countries that signed up to the Abraham Accords or others, the ramifications of that in the longer term in terms of how that has shaped not just public sentiment, but basically shaped trajectories in the years to come. A lot of that is being debated in the region.
Thank you very much. The time is approaching 2 o'clock. Maybe final words, Mr. Al-Aldein. The prospects obviously are rather grim. Mrs. Fitzgerald was talking of probably maybe new Arab Spring 2.0. What is your perspective for the region?
Well, I think the chances of another Arab Spring is negligible. It will not happen. But the region will continue to be in turmoil, conflicts, because between crises, when there's nothing else, we create them. We create new crises. This is what our leadership does best. Internally in each country, every state that you see fragile goes into more fragility. The countries that held together, they need alliance outside. We are in the middle of conflict. We are not at the beginning, but we are not at the end. Conflict will continue. No one is done. No one thinks that that's it, they had enough. And if you stop here, Iran's approach, Iran's strategy, Iran's ultimate ambition stays, and Israel, the Arabs continue to feel insecure. And even conflicts such as Syria that looks like frozen, underneath it's boiling, waiting for spanners in the works, waiting for game changers. So we should not really, in a way, come under the illusion thinking that it's just around the corner, ceasefire, this, that, we'll deal with it. No. We have fundamental structural issues to deal with. There are new alignments happening. There are too many global conflicts affecting us as well as internal ones. That is not all doom and gloom, by the way. We are still optimistic. The European investment, and that's my recommendation, policy recommendation, should really be more nuanced, hands-on, and supporting state institutions. And being realistic as well. At the moment, we are not seeing all of that. We need a common approach for state building, institution enhancing, the role of state over non-state. And there are opportunities. Look at Lebanon. If Hezbollah is defeated, you have to enhance the states so that they can provide services, good governance, and become good partners to you. The same goes for Iraq. Let's support the state rather than the non-state. There are many ways of actually having a way forward, a roadmap towards engagement between Europe and the Middle East, without necessarily promoting escalation or at the end regretting. What we are seeing at the moment in America is that in simplistic black and white terms, they decide what should be their policy, and they get it wrong every time. No surprises.
Well, I think that's not a very optimistic, but a very good end to this very interesting discussion. Mrs. Fitzgerald, thank you very much for taking part from Brussels. Mr. Pusztai, Professor, thank you very much here. Michael, I think you have the final words.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to the moderator and this wonderful panel, first of all. I would like to seize the opportunity again to thank all of you for your participation today, for your wonderful questions. Special thanks, of course, to our partners, to the keynote speakers, to the two panels, moderation. Of course, there has been a lot of food for thought, and there is no better way to digest this food of thought with food for the body as well. So therefore, let me also invite all of you to have lunch together with us in the room next door. There is a lunch provided, so if you have the time, please feel free and welcome to join. Thank you very much for your great input. I think this, from our perspective, we will certainly continue to follow up on the topics that were discussed today, to continue writing policy papers, recommendations, but also to host similar discussions and similar events in the future, and I'm always very happy to welcome you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.